Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 125 of Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. I'm Lex Starwalker, and on this show, we discuss the craft and art of game mastering. Not only do I pass along any wisdom I've gained through over 25 years of running RPGs, I also share wisdom from guest GMs and listener GMs like you. I've gotten a lot of great feedback on our last episode, episode 124, which was on Theater of the Mind play, and I'll share some of that feedback with you today. So I want to welcome you back to the show. Welcome to season 7 of Game Master's Journey. Really excited to be kicking off season 7 and back behind the mic again. Took a week off while I was moving and having a birthday, and we're getting settled into the new studio now, and really excited to be doing my first episode from the new studio. Now, before I get into today's topic, I want to let you know about a few topics that I plan on discussing in future episodes, and I'd love to get any feedback or ideas you have on these topics so that when I discuss them, I can pull in as many ideas from listeners as I can. So one topic that I'm going to be covering in the near future is gaming in between game sessions. What are some strategies that we can use as GMs to keep player interest high in between our scheduled game sessions? Are there things that we can do to keep the game going between sessions, whether we're playing online or in person? What are things that we can do to provide some engagement for the players in between those game sessions? What are ideas of how to take the gaming experience beyond just your scheduled sessions when everyone's together? So head to the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com for this episode 125, and I'll have a link to a discussion on Google Plus about the gaming in between sessions topic. And if you have any ideas, you can post them there. I'd love to hear from you. Another topic I'm going to be covering soon is for a world building episode. I thought I would field questions from you about Primordia. These could be, just really quick fire questions or more general questions, whether it's something you've wondered about the world and you're curious about, or an aspect of the world building you'd like me to focus on, or an aspect of the world you'd like me to flesh out or explain more. So I have a post for that on the Google Plus community as well. I'll have a link to that in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com if you want to submit any questions. I'll probably be using those for inspiration for more than one world building episode or segment. So feel free to shoot any questions you have at me, and I'll get to them as the show goes on. And finally, another topic I'm going to discuss in the near future is strategies for if you've given out too much loot to your player characters. And this is something that I've been guilty of myself many times in the past. I think it's something that a lot of newer GMs end up doing at one point or another, and that's just being too generous with treasure, whether it's money or magic items or whatever, and you end up in this point where you realize that the player characters are overgeared, they've got too much money, they've got too much magic, they're too powerful or whatever. What do you do when you find yourself in that situation? What are some ways that you can mitigate that? So I have a thread for this on the Google Plus community as well, and you can find a link to that in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com if you have any ideas on how to handle that. So there are 3 topics that I want to cover in the near future, and I really like to bring as much listener feedback and ideas into these discussions as I can. So please head to the relevant threads on the Google Plus community and let me know any input you'd like into the episode. And we can all learn from the massive combined experience of all the GMs that are part of our community. Now, something else I've been doing on the Google Plus community lately is I've been doing some polls, just kind of fun, random questions that I think of that could have a multiple choice answer. And so one poll that I did recently is, what level do you start your campaigns at? So this was a Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition mainly focused poll. And the question was simply, what level do you like to start your player characters at when you start a new campaign? And the choices were 1st level, 2nd level, 3rd level, 4th level, or 5th level. I would have liked to have done more choices, more higher level choices, but Google Plus only lets you have 5 options. And going by the results, I guess I probably didn't need higher level choices. So I had 43 people vote in the poll, and overwhelmingly the majority, 65% of the voters, say that they like to start their campaigns at 1st level, which wasn't surprising to me that the most people start at 1st level, but it was surprising that it was that many of the people. I expected a lower percentage than that. Our next highest was at 21% of people start at 3rd level, which I think makes sense. I think in 5th edition, third level is a great place to start. Every class has their archetype, their first archetype abilities at that point. Everybody's chosen their specialization at that point. So I think 3rd level is a great place to start. And then next at 7% was people starting at 5th level, 5% people starting at 2nd level, and only 2% of people are starting at 4th level. So that was surprising to me. I thought there would be more people starting at 2nd level, honestly, than there were. To me, it seems like good starting points of 5th edition are 1st level, 2nd level, 3rd level, 5th level, and kind of every odd level after that. So yeah, really, really interesting. So again, 65% of people start at 1st level, 21% at 3rd, 7% at 5th, 5% at 2nd, and 2% at 4th. So I'll be doing more of these polls, and maybe every episode or every few episodes, I'll give you the results of one of these polls after it's run for a while. So check out the Google Plus community to participate in these, and you can find a link to the Google Plus community for Game Master's Journey in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com.
This is Matthew Colville, and you're listening to Game Master's Journey.
I want to give a quick shout out to the patrons of Starwalker Studios. The support of the patrons makes this show possible. If you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd like to give a little back, becoming a patron is a great way to do so. Patrons get some cool perks like game material I make for Primordia and access to a special monthly podcast I produce just for the patrons. I'd also like to give a huge shout out and thank you to my Tier 4 patron, Mr. Steve Strickland. Let's give it up for Steve. Yeah.
Yes!
You the man. Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you to all the patrons. You can find out more about becoming a patron by clicking on the Patreon button at the top of the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. All right, so today for our main topic, I'm going to be going through some of the feedback that I've received on episode 124, which was on Theater of the Mind. So if you haven't listened to episode 124, I would definitely recommend checking that out before listening to this episode. And during episode 124, I presented Theater of the Mind and some strategies and tips for how to make the most of it and how to make it work for you at your table and for your group. And I've gotten quite a bit of really great feedback on that. So let's get into it. So first off, I have some feedback from Brett Nilsson on Google Plus, who said, "At last, Theater of the Mind. So many great points and tips. Where do I begin? And such perfect timing. I just ran a session of my online campaign this weekend with my first full Theater of the Mind battle in decades. Thinking back, I always had at least a dry erase board for a map. Interestingly, the player response post-session was a little mixed. For the most part, I believe the feedback was enthusiastically positive. However, there was mention of becoming distracted by other things in the room because there was nothing to look at. Your tips, I think, will help improve the next attempt. Things I need to remember are, number 1, don't bog everyone down in detail. Improvise the brief description and let the players ask questions about what they see. Number 2, in combat, I have to find a faster way to get through initiative rolls. That stopped the encounter cold as we got things situated even without a map. Possibly I could have the NPC's initiatives pre-rolled and ready. Some of the delay was technical as I worked out the process of initiative without dropping NPCs onto the virtual map. I wound up dropping them on the GM level using Roll20 so we could still use its turn tracker. And number 3, I think using an illustration on the page instead of a battle map to convey the scene or atmosphere of the player's surroundings will help the players visualize the scene and mood. I'm a tremendous fan of background music for this very reason as well. So yeah, that's a nice little recap of some of the tips from last week's episode 124. And I have noticed the same issue with initiative. It's definitely a bigger issue if you're using miniatures because you have to add to that the process of setting up the actual miniatures. But even in Theater of the Mind, initiative can really kind of derail things as everybody has to roll and the DM has to scurry around to get everybody in initiative order with all the NPCs and roll for all the NPCs. And it helps, I think, to create that disconnect and give us more of that feeling of we're playing two different games. We're playing the role-playing game on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're playing the tactical battle game or the war game. And that rolling for initiative and that break that it gives you in the momentum and the pacing of your game is this perfect signifier and symbol of, oh, we're changing games now. And so I've wanted to get away from that too and find ways to streamline it myself. And I came up with an idea that I've tried once or twice in my online games, and it worked really well. The trick is remembering to do it, which there have been many times that I've forgotten to do it, but when I remember to do it, it works really well. And that simply is rolling initiative ahead of time. So when I'm preparing a session, if I know what the first encounter is going to be, if I know who the bad guys in the first encounter are going to be, I will go ahead and roll their initiative before we even get together to play and have that recorded somewhere. And then what I do is as soon as we get together to play, first thing before we even start, I have all the player characters roll initiative. I then, while people are getting situated and shooting the shit and whatnot and talking in character or whatever they're doing, at some point before that first encounter, when I have a minute, I take the player rolls and the NPC rolls and I make my initiative order. Now, the way I've been doing this lately is I use index cards, and I have an index card for each player character, and that will usually have their passive perception on it. A lot of times I'll put their armor class on there, any other notes I might need to know about that character during a combat, and then I'll also record their initiative number on that. I have similar cards for NPCs or monsters that are going to be in the combat. If it's a monster from the monster manual and I can fit it, a lot of times I will just print out the stat block and glue it onto the card. And then I'll put the monsters initiative on there. And again, I'm rolling these ahead of time, so I record that ahead of time. And then what I do is when I have a minute, I just put those cards in initiative order in the stack. And then when we get to the combat, then I just flip over cards to see who goes next. And then I have the person's armor class. If it's NPC or PC, I've got their passive perception, any other numbers I might need. Again, if it's a monster, a lot of times I have the whole stat block on that index card. So that's how I do it. So, beginning of the session, I get the player characters initiative rolls for the first encounter. I've already got the NPCs for the entire session done before the session starts. And then sometime before that first encounter, I get those cards in order. So when the first encounter happens, we can seamlessly transition into combat. There's no need to pause to roll initiative or for me to get things situated. We can just segue right into combat, and there's no break between the role playing and the combat. And that works really well. And then what I do is at the end of that first encounter, at the very end of the encounter, when people are looting bodies or getting loot or whatever, I then have the player characters roll initiative again and record those numbers. And then I use those for the next encounter. So that's how I do it. And again, it's worked really well when I remember to do it. The trick is remembering to get those initiative rolls at the beginning of the session and remembering to call for initiative rolls at the end of combats, and also remembering as part of my prep for the session, doing all my initiative rolls ahead of time and having those recorded on those index cards. Boz Bunnick also responded about episode 124 and said, I wanted to chip in about the initiative that Brett brought up. Especially if you use Roll20, you can pre-roll initiative for all monsters. They stay hidden until you actually get them on the map. And yeah, that's a great point. So here's a little tip for those of you using Roll20. The way that you can do this is you can put the tokens for your monsters or your NPCs on the GM layer of Roll20. And you can even roll their initiative and put them in the turn tracker. And as long as they're on that GM layer, the player characters won't see them. If you have the turn tracker open, they won't see the monsters in the turn tracker. They will not see those monsters either on the map or in the turn tracker until you move them to the token layer. Or I guess if you move them to the map layer, they would see them at that point too, but you wouldn't do that. You'd move them to the token layer. Also, players don't see the turn tracker at all unless you reveal it on your screen. So what you can do in your prep before the session starts is you can roll those initiatives for your first monsters, for your first encounter, and have those in the turn tracker. And then you can close that turn tracker and the PCs won't even see the turn tracker until you open it again. And when you open it again, those initiatives will still be there. So this can be nice if you don't want to tip the players off that there is a combat coming by having that turn tracker open. Also, it takes up space, and why have it there when you don't need it? So Boz goes on to say, I've really taken to putting the initiative rolls of the players in place right away. I have them re-roll after fights to keep it a little bit mixed like Lex does, but you can just leave it unchanged if you want. So what he's saying here is if you want, you could just have the PCs use the same initiative for every combat or every encounter in that session. Personally, I wouldn't recommend that. That gets a little too predictable. So I would definitely recommend doing a different initiative for every encounter. This way, you don't have to bother with rolls clogging up a fight, and it helps because you can get them into an encounter without having to alert them to it by making initiative rolls. For example, when they enter an empty room. And that's another great point too, because just the words roll for initiative tells players, usually most players, that signifies we're going into combat now. And there are times that I like to use initiative even out of combat, just to make sure that everybody gets a free turn or a fair turn. You know, everybody gets the same amount of time, everybody gets the same attention from the GM, and everybody gets a fair chance to do or say what they want to do. So a lot of times, especially with a bigger group, when things are getting kind of rambunctious and people are talking over one another, I'll call it for an initiative roll just so that everybody can have a turn. And there are times that I like to use initiative outside of combat, but the problem is as soon as I ask people to roll initiative, they assume that there's a combat happening, and it can actually kind of maneuver or manipulate or kind of influence the players into approaching something as a combat when maybe they wouldn't have otherwise. And I think that having them roll the initiative at the end of an encounter for the next one can alleviate that as well, because then you have that initiative number for them whenever you need it next. You can use that and not have to signify that, oh, we're going to do a combat now. I expect you to fight this person. Boz goes on to say, I think adding in a flavor picture for the encounter does help a lot. It helps build an atmosphere and things like that. You can also put tokens on there and keep score if you want, or you can just have it as a wallpaper with maybe some music. I also like the zones idea, if only for yourself to keep a bit of an idea of where everyone is in the combat. I often try to bring in that feeling of the characters having to explore, ask what they see, etc. It keeps them more engaged. They remember more, even things I forget, and it makes them think about the possibilities. And then we can use the PC smelling, hearing, or feeling something to add to the bewilderment. Another point about the exuberant descriptions is that they can get a bit overbearing. For example, I watched the newish Force Grey actual play with Matt Mercer. I am glad those are short episodes because while it is great to hear everyone dramatically play out action and get detail-rich descriptions of dragons, undead, and things like that, after a while, it gets tedious to listen to. Also, I felt the feeling of being lost in an unknown world gets better conveyed if the players have to find out more things on their own by asking about it. And yeah, I completely agree with all of that. Player engagement is really important. If the players are asking questions about the area they're in, they're probably more engaged than if they're just passively looking at a map or an illustration. I also think it's much easier and more natural for a player to ask for another detail, like, is there something I can hide behind, if there's already this back and forth established and going on between the GM and the players. And I think Boz's point about the actual play is true and something I've noticed as well. When I'm playing or running an RPG, I often find that combat is the most fun part. It's the part of the game where I'm often the most engaged in a given session, whether I'm the player or the GM. However, if I'm watching an actual play or listening to one, combat is by far the least entertaining part. And the more crunchy the system is, the worse combat is to watch or listen to the point that I've often found myself wishing when watching or listening to an actual play that they would just skip the combat entirely and just give me a summary of what happened. Like, cut out the whole actual play of the combat and instead give me a quick narration of what happened during that combat. You know, because we'll have a combat that in real game time would take less than a minute, but in real world playing time takes half an hour or an hour. And that's a half hour or hour of kind of tedious, quote, entertainment. For these reasons, I think that theater of the mind is a great technique for GMs of actual play, even more so if it's on a podcast with no visual aspect like you would have on YouTube. Verbal descriptions by the GM, questions from the players, and answers from the GM will all be more listening to watch or listen to than just looking at a map or an illustration. And if it's a podcast, the map or illustration isn't going to work at all. Also, keeping combat as fast and loose as possible and keeping it cinematic, keeping the action going are even more important when you're talking about actual play that people are going to be watching. And it's even more important to not get bogged down in things like looking up rules or having rules discussions. So that's kind of a tangent, but that is an aspect of this that I didn't bring up last episode is, if you are thinking of doing an actual play for entertainment, theater of the mind has a lot of assets to it in that regard. And it might be a little counterintuitive because people might think, it'll be more entertaining if there's a grid and a map and tokens to watch. But really, when you think about a D&D combat, think about that hour-long combat, how much of that time is actually people moving tokens and there's actually anything happening on that battle map, and how much of that time is other things like rolling and calculating and all that stuff. So I feel like a relatively small percentage of that time is actually anything really happening with the battle map. So you're not really referring to it that much anyway as a viewer, and definitely not as a listener. It's useless as a listener. So I think that a nice description by the DM and this back and forth of players asking questions, DM giving answers is going to be a lot more entertaining for an audience and for the players. My favorite part of the show is when I hear from listener GMs like you. If you have feedback for the show, whether it's a comment on today's topic or an idea for a future topic, I'd love to hear from you. There are a lot of great ways to get a hold of me. You can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com, follow me on Twitter at LexStarWalker, Google plus LexStarWalker, and finally, you can visit the website starwalkerstudios.com to get links to my Patreon page, YouTube channel, and more. Finally, you can find a link to the Game Masters Journey Google Plus community at starwalkerstudios.com, and the community is a great place to bounce ideas back and forth with other listener GMs. You can also comment on the show episodes, share your own homebrew world, and ask questions of the many experienced GMs that are part of our community. You can find all this and more at starwalkerstudios.com. All right, getting back to our Theater of the Mind feedback. Next, I heard from DM Nell on Google Plus, who says, "Very good podcast. Thanks for the shout out." You're welcome. Lex did an excellent job of promoting the Theater of the Mind style of play and providing lots of great advice on how to do so. The GMs from the convention I attended would have benefited from this podcast. I must say, though, that I felt almost compelled to do a counterpoint post here, touting the merits of grid/miniature play, but I didn't want to be a dick. I don't think that'd be being a dick at all, DMNL. And if you or anyone else would like to be the devil's advocate and tell us all the things you love about using a grid and using minis and things like that, feel free to reply to the post for this episode 125 in the Google Plus community, and let me know any thoughts that you have about it. And if I get enough feedback on that, I would be happy to do a similar episode for grid and mini play and kind of tips and tricks on how to make that work for you. But I will especially rely on you, the listeners, for that, because again, it's not my preferred method of play and it's not something I use a whole lot. So if there are any advanced ways to make it less of a pain in the ass, I probably don't know them. So yeah, I don't think that would be being a dick at all. My goal wasn't really to say that Theater of the Mind is the best way to play or the only way to play or anything like that, but I did kind of take the approach of trying to convince you of the merits of Theater of the Mind, because episode 124 was partly for GMs who've never done Theater of the Mind and partly for GMs who maybe use Theater of the Mind but are looking for ways to do it better. And I thought both of those groups would probably benefit from a little convincing as to why is it even worth it? You know, I said Theater of the Mind is its own skill set, which it is. Why is it worth it to me as a GM to develop this new skill set if I'm already using grids and minis and I'm already comfortable with that? What's the benefit to me? What's the point? So I did kind of take a kind of persuasive angle, trying to persuade you why at least I think Theater of the Mind is very useful and at least in certain situations is superior to grid and mini play. So maybe I got a little too impassioned about that and came across a little too strong. Again, that's kind of one of the downsides of me being behind the mic by myself a little bit. There's no one to call me on it in real time if I'm getting carried away. But I would definitely be open to doing an episode on grid and mini play if I hear from people with enough ideas to talk about it, or at least do a segment on it. All right, back to DM Nell's post. Let's see, where was I? But I didn't want to be a dick. You're not being a dick. I will say, however, that I think Lex was a little hard on the grid mini play style. I've been playing D&D since 1982, and my group has always used miniatures and a grid of some sort to some extent, along with Theater of the Mind. So again, there's no absolutes. I said in 124 that, most people back in those days were not using grids and minis before 3rd edition. I'd never personally seen them used before 3rd edition. But that doesn't mean that no one was doing it. And I'm pretty sure that I didn't say that no one was doing it, because I definitely don't think that. I mean, there definitely were people that we're doing it. Back to the email. I prefer grid mini play over theater of the mind when done well. Like theater of the mind, grid mini play takes practice and is an art. I find that the combination of theater of the mind and mini play is more enjoyable for my group and is my preferred method of running games. Plus, you can take pictures. But I totally agree that D&D doesn't need minis or a grid to be enjoyable, and theater of the mind is perfectly valid and enjoyable style of play when done right. And yeah, this is going to come down to taste. There are going to be DMs out there who love their grid, they love their minis, and they're not going to do a single encounter in theater of the mind. There are DMs on the other extreme that hate grids and minis, love theater of the mind, and are never going to use a grid or minis. And then there are DMs everywhere in between on that spectrum that are using some of the times and the rest of the time. So that's fine. And players have preferences too. And kind of like in all things in this hobby, the important thing is finding synergy between what you want as a GM and what your players want. If you're the kind of GM that you only want to do theater of the mind and you never want to use a grid of minis, but most or all of your players are grid players and don't like theater of the mind, then you're going to have problems. So ideally, you're going to find a group that is kind of near where you are on that spectrum, right? They don't have to be in the exact same spot. As long as they're close, everybody will be happy. And it's not so much that one method is hands down the best or better than the other. It's more what's the best for you as a GM and what's the best for your group. Different GMs have different styles, and some GM styles may work better with grid and mini play than with theater of the mind. Some GM styles may work better with a combination of the two. So it's up to you to find your own style and to find your own voice as a GM and to find what works for you. Regardless of where you are on that spectrum, I think it's wise and beneficial to have all the tools in your toolbox you can. So try not to come from a position of an extreme of, I'm never going to use a grid or I'm never going to use theater of the mind, because that limits you. Try to be open to using whatever's best for that particular encounter. Me personally, I was pretty strong for theater of the mind in episode 124. And in general, all things being equal, I prefer it. However, that said, there are times that I am going to use a grid and I'm going to use minis because that's what's going to work for that particular encounter with that particular group. And, we do, it's kind of weird. We do have kind of two games within one in this hobby. We have the RPG/storytelling game, and we have the tactical miniatures game. And they're two very different play experiences. They're two different play styles, but they're kind of married together in this thing that we call D&D. And each gamer and each GM and each player is going to have her own opinion on each of those games and which they prefer over the other. Do they like them equally? Things like that. So for me personally, I don't terribly enjoy the tactical miniatures game. For instance, I tried X-Wing, the X-Wing game, which is nothing but a tactical miniatures game, and I was bored to tears with it. I took it back. I returned it after one game. I was like, I don't want to play this. This is boring as hell. But obviously that's a very popular game. Obviously there are lots of people who love that game. So, that is a play experience that some people enjoy. It's a play experience that some people don't enjoy. So personally, I look for ways to use theater of the mind as much as possible and to minimize or even eliminate minis and grids as much as I can, because that's the kind of gameplay I prefer. However, some players love minis and grids, and for them, D&D wouldn't be nearly as fun without them. Those players probably wouldn't be super satisfied with a purely theater of the mind game. Then, of course, there are players like DM Nell who enjoy both, and those players will probably be happiest in a game that's a nice blend of the two. So there's, again, it's a spectrum and people are all over that spectrum. So again, part of my strategy with the last episode was to present the pros of theater of the mind play for GMs who maybe haven't tried it or haven't had much experience with it or don't feel proficient with it. I made the assumption that you're familiar with mini and grid play and that you maybe need to be convinced of the merits of theater of the mind. And perhaps I got a little too enthusiastic, and perhaps that assumption didn't come through clear that we all kind of know where it's at with grid and mini play. Like, we've all experienced that. We all know the pros and cons of that, but maybe we don't all know the same with theater of the mind because it's a play style that's not as popular in recent editions as it used to be. Now, sometimes personally, I can really get into a battle with miniatures and a grid. For instance, if I'm running a published adventure with a really nice map and lots of traps or a maze or something like that, then I want to use that super cool map. Or if you're going to do a good old fashioned dungeon crawl, which I actually love. I love dungeon crawls, probably because I never did many of them. Back in the day that everybody else was dungeon crawling, we were doing wilderness exploration. So, most of my experience with dungeon crawls has been in like Pathfinder in 5th edition. So, I think maybe a lot of people got burnt out on them in the early days of D&D. In the earliest days of D&D, that's kind of all it was dungeon crawls. So, I may be coming from a weird point of view there, but I really like them. And if you're doing a dungeon crawl, then a grid of minis is the way to go. It's kind of hard to call it a dungeon crawl if you're not using a grid of minis. For instance, if I ran the Castle Ravenloft portion of Curse of Strahd, I would definitely want to use the map and I'd want to use minis because the map is so good. And Castle Ravenloft is a dungeon crawl. So in that situation, I would want to use a map. I would want to use a grid and I would want to use miniatures, even though in general, I prefer not to. Josh Davis also commented on Google Plus and said, just finished the episode. Definitely a good one with some very useful tidbits. I do play-by-post, and more of this is actually relevant than you might think. In many of the play-by-post games I'm in, there simply are no maps, minis, or anything. Most of the combat is 100% theater of the mind, and we tend to play it how you said. Give the players the benefit of the doubt, use general ranges for distances, short, medium, long, and keep descriptions brief. We don't want to write a multi-page paper every time the players enter a new room. I like your idea of an athletics check to let some of the players move faster. I may implement that in my future games. So yeah, that's great, Josh. Thanks for writing in about that. I didn't even think of the application in play-by-post games, but yeah, I can totally see how theater of the mind would be the way you'd have to go in those games. So I'm glad you found the episode useful. All right, I've got another comment from Google Plus. I'm not sure how to pronounce this name. I'm going to say Hugh Tran. I'm 90% certain that is incorrect. So if you can let me know the correct pronunciation, I'll get it right next time, I promise. But Mr. Tran says, I've seen the bullseye range method before, but I've never heard of the quadrant variant versus just kind of placing things around the bullseye to delineate relative position. This is wonderful because I think I can put some more interesting obstacles on one quadrant's band without worrying about it muddying the other quadrants and players asking me if it applies to them. Thanks for sharing it. You're totally welcome. And again, I want to give kudos to Brian Kearns, who was the one who introduced me to the bullseye method. I don't know if this was Brian's idea, if he came up with it or if he got it from somewhere else, but I got the idea from Brian. And so I want to give credit to him. I know I did so in the last episode, but then it kind of sounded like it was all my idea, and it definitely wasn't. I'm not honestly even sure if the quadrant thing was my idea or if I got that from somewhere else. I don't think I got that from Brian, but I might have gotten it from somewhere else. But so I'm not complaining or I'm not claiming that I came up with the bullseye idea, but I think it's a very elegant solution. And, the quadrant idea is just one way that you could refine it if you need to get more resolution from that system. And I'm sure there's lots of other things you could do with it in specific situations to get it to do what you need to do. So that's the last of the feedback that I want to go through today. I want to thank everyone who has submitted feedback on episode 124 or on anything. I really appreciate all the ideas you guys send in. And I just want to give a thank you and a shout out to everyone on the Google Plus community for Game Master's Journey. It's a really great place. We're up to something like, I think 830 members now. And we have quite a few people who are posting on a regular basis. People post about their homebrew worlds. People ask questions about situations that they're dealing with at their tables and ask for advice on how to handle them. People post play reports, kind of what's happening in my game right now. And people post artwork that they find inspirational and all kinds of great stuff. And of course, I post anything related to the show on there, updates, things like that. And I just really appreciate how people are participating in the community. And with the exception of a handful of times, I've had obvious spam accounts join and start posting spam, which of course I took care of right away. With those few exceptions, there hasn't been a single incident of someone being an asshole or a douchebag or being disrespectful or rude or anything like that. And, I at least observe and read, if not post in, a lot of RPG communities on Google Plus, D&D and otherwise. And the Game Master's Journey community has become my go-to place on Google Plus. I pay less and less attention to the other ones because it's just such a nicer environment. People are more respectful. People are more open to different ideas, and people don't get into these childish bickering matches about various things that you see on the other communities and the other forums that are out there. And I'm very proud of the community, and I'm very proud of everyone who posts in there and how well everybody is playing together. And we have a pretty good spread of DMing styles and even games people are running, and everyone's managing to get along. So kudos to everyone who's participating. I really appreciate how well behaved everyone is. It sounds terrible, doesn't it? It sounds like I'm talking to a class of third graders or something. And I'm sorry it sounds like that, but in this day and age, it's so hard to find that online. There are so many communities, and I'm not going to name names, but you probably know who they are, that are not like that, where they're filled with trolls and people who are jerks and people who are immature and people who attack people who think differently than they do. And I'm just really, really happy with our community and with the participation. And participation has been increasing lately, and that's awesome. So if you haven't checked out the Game Master's Journey Google Plus community, definitely do so. And I think you'll enjoy yourself there. It's a great place to go. If you want to share some things from your game, some cool things you've come up with, it's a great place to do that. If you want to share your homebrew world, or if you just have questions, whether it's a rules question about a specific game or it's a more general game mastering question, like how do I handle this at my table or whatever. It's a great place. Hope you check it out. All right, well, that is going to wrap up episode 125 of Game Master's Journey and our first episode of season 7. Hope you enjoyed the show. Hope you enjoyed the feedback on episode 124. And again, I have other topics I'm looking for feedback on. So if you just head to the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com, I have 3 topics with links to them that you can give feedback on. How to keep player engagement between sessions, questions about my homebrew world of Primordia, and what to do when you've given your player characters way too much loot in whatever game you're playing. So those are 3 topics I want to explore on future episodes. And again, you can find links to the posts on those in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com, and you can weigh in with what you think. And again, I am always open to feedback on any of the topics we discuss on this show. Pretty laid back on this show. I'm happy to return to a topic if I get a lot of feedback on it. So, even if you're a new listener and you're getting caught up and you listen to an older episode and you've got some feedback on it, don't hesitate to send that in, because especially if it's an older episode, maybe it's time to revisit that topic. Maybe we've all got new ideas now and we can address it from a different angle. I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music provided by Cloudwalker, Renfield, Stanko, Transboy, and Ish. Please see the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/GameMastersJourney.